Battle in court. The Trump administration refuses to allow 2 illegal immigrant teens to have abortions. We have the details. GOP votes. Congress weighs in on a sweeping tax reform bill. We'll tell you what it will mean for most Americans. In the crossfire, we hear about life for Christians in Israel since President Trump's decision to acknowledge Jerusalem as the country's capital. And a city with good taste. An exhibit in London includes models of buildings, most of which are edible. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 19th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, in for Lauren Ashburn. The Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to intervene in a federal judge's decision that allows 2 undocumented teenage immigrants to get abortions. White House correspondent Mark Irons says an appeals court is delaying one of the abortions, but time is running out. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Both teens are 17 years old. One is 10 weeks, the other 22 weeks pregnant. The Trump administration doesn't want to participate in the abortions, considering that both undocumented immigrants are staying in U.S. government shelters. In a statement, the Department of Health and Human Services says HHS-funded facilities that provide temporary shelter and care for unaccompanied alien minors should not become way stations for these children to get taxpayer-facilitated abortions. Catherine Glenn Foster, the president and CEO of Americans United for Life, agrees. She says the judge's decision to allow the abortions sets an extremely dangerous precedent.
First of all, it seems to indicate that these non-citizens, undocumented immigrants, have a constitutional right to an abortion. And more than that, that they have the right to taxpayer funding being expended to facilitate these abortions.
Scott Lloyd, a former attorney for the Knights of Columbus, heads the HHS office that oversees the immigrant shelters. He says HHS should not be supporting abortion services pre or post-release, but rather counseling for life-affirming options. These are the next cases we're seeing after an undocumented teen immigrant had an abortion back in October. The American Civil Liberties Union is representing the undocumented teens. An attorney with the ACLU accuses the Trump administration of, quote, a cruel and dystopian crusade to block abortion access for some of the most marginalized people in our country. The Trump administration is appealing the case of the teen who is 10 weeks pregnant. We could expect a decision in that case as early as this evening. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Pennsylvania's Democratic Governor Tom Wolf vetoes a pro-life bill passed by the Republican-controlled legislature. The bill would have banned abortions after the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. Its sponsor says a baby can survive outside the womb before 24 weeks, and laws must catch up. 67 national and state pro-life groups tell Congress they oppose any spending bill that includes federal funding for elective abortions. Congress is reportedly considering including a proposal to stabilize Obamacare. That proposal would allow taxpayer funding of abortion in a must-pass spending bill later this week. The group signs a letter that says, in part, enactment of Obamacare ushered in a new era of abortion funding, unleashing federal subsidies for insurance coverage that includes abortion on demand. Vice President Mike Pence is postponing his trip to the Middle East until mid-January. Pence cites the need to preside over the Senate tax reform vote as the reason to push the Egypt and Israel trip back. His decision comes amid protests in the region over the Trump administration's decision to designate Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The House passes a sweeping rewrite of the nation's tax laws. Speaker Paul Ryan is dismissing criticism that the package benefits only the wealthy, and for now, House Republicans are celebrating.
Today in the People's House, we're preparing to send the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill to the president's desk.
House Republicans take a victory lap, calling this an historic day, more than 3 decades in the making.
It's an honor to be Speaker of the House to see this. The last time this got done, the job I had, I was working the Quarter Pounder Grill at McDonald's at the intersection of Highway 14 and 990 in Janesville, Wisconsin. It's a long time in coming.
That was in 1986 when Congress passed and President Reagan signed the first overhaul of the nation's tax code.
Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Today's bill will provide steep tax cuts to businesses and more modest tax cuts to middle and low-income families. It doubles the child tax credit to $2,000, preserves the current adoption tax credit, and repeals the Obamacare individual insurance mandate the requirement that all Americans carry health insurance or face a penalty. Critics point to the $1.46 trillion it will add to the nation's debt over 10 years. Robert Warren, a professor of business at Catholic University, says that will be a burden to future generations. The retired IRS special agent also says the bill overlooks one crucial source of revenue.
It doesn't address what we call the tax gap, which is the amount of money the IRS should be collecting but doesn't because of basically due to fraud. So about $500 billion a year is lost by the Treasury because they don't have enough people and they don't have the equipment to go out and enforce the tax code and collect that money.
Joining us now is Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. He directs financial and economic policies at the think tank. So, Bill, Democrats say the bill basically favors the wealthy, not the middle class. What do we know about what the bill will do for the middle class?
Well, it will reduce taxes across the board for all groups out there, but because obviously the higher income you are, the more the tax cut benefits you. So as an example, for a middle income, is say in the 40 to 50,000 income bracket, you'll see it next year probably around about a $900 reduction in your taxes. Not a great deal, but $900. If you're up in the 100,000 to 200,000, you'll probably see a tax cut that's equivalent to about $2,000 or more dollars. So it depends upon where you are in the income distribution. Not all people will receive tax cuts either. I like to point out that not everybody benefits from this, though that's what is usually advertised. About 10% of those who are taxpayers out there will see no benefit, in fact may see an actual increase. And most importantly, this tax bill, the way it was designed, is that by 2025 a lot of these tax cuts go away, and indeed taxes go up on the middle class after 2025.
Okay, I was seeing some estimates. According to some estimates, in 2019, Americans earning between $20,000 and $50,000, that lower bracket, will see an average of 10% in tax cuts. So is that right? Is that accurate?
That's about right, and I think there are various estimates out there, but I looked at the estimates from the Joint Tax Committee this morning and went through their distributional tables. It turns out to be in that range, about 10% of a reduction. But remember, it's 10% reduction in a very low base, and so it translates into something, like I said, maybe into the $500 range in terms of a tax cut for next year.
It's really not high enough.
It's not high, and particularly when you focus on the fact that these people in this particular income bracket have a high level of debt out there. It's nice to have, but I think that's important. I think the bigger issue here is whether or not the corporate tax changes and the issues of increasing the employment opportunities, if that might benefit individuals either through increased wages, which are not calculated in this particular estimates that we're putting forth here today.
Okay, well, one other point here is that the tax bill will get rid of the unpopular Obamacare insurance mandate. Well, obviously that you've worked with on some of these issues. Tell us why squashing the insurance mandate, though, is in a tax bill.
Well, because the Supreme Court ruled many years ago that this particular penalty was a tax. It was a tax, and that's the way it was ruled by the Supreme Court, and therefore it could be put into the tax bill. I will want to point out something that I don't think has been reported very clearly, and that is that the repeal of the individual mandate does not take place until 2019. At the end, so for 2018, from now until the end of a year from now, the penalty still applies.
Okay, we will continue to follow all the developments with regards to this tax bill. Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President, Bipartisan Policy Center, thanks so much.
Thank you. All right.
Senator John McCain is missing the tax reform vote, but the ailing Republican took to Twitter yesterday, writing, "Thanks to everyone for your support and words of encouragement. I'm feeling well and looking forward to returning to work after the holidays." The 81-year-old is being treated for brain cancer. Federal investigators say the Amtrak train that derailed yesterday in Washington state was traveling 50 miles over the speed limit. At least 3 people were killed, more than 100 sent to the hospital.
Our full investigative GO team has arrived. Some of them arrived earlier yesterday, and they will be looking at all aspects of this accident.
The data recorder in the locomotive showed the train was traveling 80 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. It was the train's inaugural trip from Seattle to Portland. The White House is blaming this year's WannaCry cyber attack on North Korea. The Department of Homeland Security says a careful investigation revealed evidence North Korea was directly responsible. The ransomware attack targeted companies and governments in more than 150 countries in May, locking up digital documents, databases, and other files, and demanding a ransom for their release. Catholics in the Philippines marked 9 days before Christmas with daily pre-dawn masses. Millions of Filipinos celebrate the annual tradition. The services pay particular homage to Mary. The Vietnamese government demands the removal of a nativity scene from a Catholic church. This picture shows 9 priests and several parishioners posing in front of the Christmas creche. The government says it's illegal because it was built on land involved in an ownership dispute. However, local Catholic officials say the area was donated to the parish. One witness says military personnel have been deployed around the church. The head of Iraq's Chaldean Catholic Church says he is worried about the steadily dwindling number of Christians in the region. More than a decade ago, there were 1.5 million Iraqi Christians. Now there's around 500,000.
We suffered not only from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda, also from legislation, constitution. There are articles against Christians and other minorities.
Patriarch Louis Raphael Sacco says thousands of faithful left when the Islamic State blitzed western Iraq in 2014. The Patriarch also calls for an end to the country's discrimination against Christians. And the treatment of the Christian minority came up during a meeting Pope Francis held with King Abdullah of Jordan in the Vatican today. The Holy Father and the King discussed the importance of helping Christians in the region stay in their homeland, as well as peace and stability in the Middle East. Francis visited Jordan during his 2014 trip to the Holy Land. And the Holy Father is calling on journalists to report the news fairly.
Si avverte in modo pesante la necessità di un'informazione affidabile.
Pope Francis told Catholic media this weekend that journalists perform a mission that is among the most fundamental to democratic societies, but he reminded them to provide precise, complete, and correct information and not to sensationalize the news. Juliet Lindley is EWTN News Nightly's Vatican correspondent. She joins us from Rome. Juliet, the Pope went so far as to say if journalists don't do their job well, it's sinful. What did he mean by that?
Well, if we look at it in basic terms, if you or I are not doing our job well and we're lying or miscommunicating, then that would be a sin. Or as the Pope put it, you are damaging the hearts of the people that you're reporting to, and you're damaging your own hearts. Now, when he said that, he was talking to a large group of Italian journalists from 3,000 media outlets, and he reminded them that disinformation, calumny, sensationalism, and defamation are serious sins. So he told these journalists that he was talking to, your job today is one of the most important in the world. It's so important for you to stick to the facts, to report things correctly, and to not misinform the people who are relying on you to be informed.
Well, as you know, back here in the U.S., President Trump often talks about fake news. Now the Pope plans to dedicate his upcoming annual communications message to fake news. What's his take on it?
Yeah, it does seem a bit ironic, doesn't it, Wyatt, that these two leaders who have almost been at loggerheads, if you want, or certainly have not seen eye to eye on key issues like migration and even the environment, should be addressing the press using the same term of fake news. Now, there is a difference, and in this case, the Pope is saying that he's going to use the theme of fake news as the theme for the next World Day of Social Communications, which takes place next May 2018, on the 13th of May.
What other advice does Pope Francis have for journalists?
Well, in essence, Wyatt, you could almost say it's the same advice or the same rules and regulations and principles and values that we're given at journalism school. Be precise, be clear, use language that is not incendiary. Encourage also, he says, encourage people to reflect and weigh your words carefully before using them. Do not exaggerate, do not use allusion, and do not use ambiguity. Wyatt?
It's so interesting to hear about that because it's not very often we hear Pope Francis talk about journalism specifically, but it is now. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent, thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Coming up, Oh Little Town, a look at what it's like to work in Bethlehem, 500 yards from where Christ was born. And valuable advice. We ask a business expert if money really can buy happiness.
La vita cristiana si impara tutti I giorni.
Pope Francis says God is fruitful and he wants the faithful to be as well. Countries that practice sterilization take the opposite approach. The Holy Father says such places suffer from, quote, a demographic winter. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee in for Lauren Ashburn. The United States has vetoed a resolution supported by 14 other UN Security Council members. It would have required President Trump to rescind his declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The resolution did not pass. However, it shows deep global opposition to the president's decision. But what is it like in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, where there is bitterness and conflict despite being the place of Christ's birth? For more on this, we welcome back Michelle Bowe to the program. She just came back from a visit to the Holy Family Hospital of Bethlehem, where she is the president of its foundation. She helps raise awareness for the Catholic hospital serving the local population. So, Michelle, what has been the impact of President Trump's decision there in Bethlehem?
Well, immediately after, there were 3 days of strikes, which were peaceful strikes where the schools were closed and shops were closed for the first couple of days. But the biggest impact has been the pilgrims haven't come. The streets are empty. It's very quiet. It's really hurting the Christian community, which is really the community that's most involved in hospitality.
Because so many people, I would imagine, come around this time.
It's the busiest time of year. It's the most joyful time of year. There's a gorgeous creche in Major Square, life size. There's a Christmas tree with a small creche under it. The whole city was really just with great anticipation for the coming of our Lord and the coming of the pilgrims.
And so what have then Christians been telling you? Are they worried, having not had the tourists there?
The Christian families are worried that some of the pilgrimage that are coming, say, in March have already canceled, and everyone is really just praying that people will reconsider, because the streets of Bethlehem are peaceful. It's where the Prince of Peace was born, and you can really feel the peace amidst the very quiet streets of Bethlehem.
Sure. Well, tell us a little bit more about the work of the hospital itself. I know you do a lot of outreach to the local community.
Indeed. We deliver 4,200 babies in the community. It's about 70% of the babies in the region. We have an outreach clinic that goes out into the desert to visit people who have a hard time getting into the hospital. These are people who have no access to water, electricity, or heat, and it's cold this time of year.
Has that been slowed down at all since the protests?
It was slowed down. People were a little afraid to travel because they weren't sure how things would go, and they weren't sure if the checkpoints would close, and poor people can't afford to spend the night in Bethlehem. They have to be home. So the hospital traffic was slowed a little bit, but the mothers came in, we delivered their babies. Our 170 employees always show up. So that with the hospital, it was business as usual.
Okay. What can people do to help, Michelle, if they want to do something?
This is the time of year we would love to have donations at www.birthplaceofhope.org. Sponsor the birth of a child in Bethlehem. Sponsor a pediatrician's visit for a well baby. Sponsor a day in the NICU. It's the only NICU in the region that can save babies as little as 18 ounces.
Sure. I know it's such an important ministry there, and know that we will be praying for you guys as well. Michelle Bowe, Ambassador for the Holy Family Hospital of Bethlehem Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The U.S. bishops are calling for prayers to overturn a federal judge's decision to block the Trump administration from enforcing new pro-life provisions. On Monday, a judge in Philadelphia granted a temporary injunction on rules allowing broad religious or moral exemptions to abortion. Archbishop Joseph Kurtz, who heads the Bishops' Religious Liberty Committee, says the ruling is, quote, a serious injustice. For more on this story, you can check out our news partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Up next, what's the cost? An expert tells us if money brings happiness or more problems. And a sweet place to visit. We tell you what's so unique about an exhibit in London that features bridges and skyscrapers. Today is the feast day of Blessed Pope Urban V. He was born in France in the early 14th century and became a Benedictine monk. Pope Urban spent most of his pontificate living in Avignon, France. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, in for Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis moves 2 major 20th century Catholic clergymen on the road to possible sainthood. Father Patrick Peyton preached to millions on radio, television, and film. Peyton staged massive prayer rallies, helped spread the message to stars like Bing Crosby and Lucille Ball. Peyton coined the saying, "The family that prays together stays together." Cardinal Stefan Wydzinski was a mentor to future Pope John Paul II. He was Poland's primate and a leading moral authority. Pope Francis named both venerable 2 steps before sainthood. The definition of happiness can be elusive, but not since 1972. A national survey has asked Americans what they think and feel on certain topics, including their mental well-being. The answers give politicians and scholars clear ideas on the country's mindset. Some of the more revealing findings are based on happiness and money. In 2010, on the heels of the Great Recession, 28.8% of Americans said they were, quote, very happy. It was a record low. In 2014, that number rose to nearly 33%. So did the economy's upturn have an impact? To answer that question, we're joined by Jay Richards, assistant professor in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. You also know him as the host of A Force for Good on EWTN. Jay, welcome back. Is there a connection between our finances and happiness?
There is. I mean, it's not as simple as money can buy happiness, but if you look at happiness surveys, it's sort of common sense. If you're really poor and don't know where your next meal is coming from or how you're going to pay the rent, you're going to be miserable. It really is that simple. And so essentially income and happiness correlate in these surveys up until about upper middle class. So in other words, once you get to a certain threshold, say family income on average about $75,000 a year, more money adds almost no additional happiness. So really what you want to think of is people that are really, really poor tend to be unhappy on average, but being really wealthy doesn't really add very much to your happiness either.
So as Catholics then, it kind of seems like balance here is the key, right? I mean, balancing between money and then true happiness, which we know is not material. So how do we view that?
Absolutely. I mean, think of it as just the fact that we are these amazing hybrids of the spiritual and the material. We're not angels, but we're not beasts. And so we need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to drink. So those things matter. On the other hand, that's not full happiness. It's not the exercise of virtue that gives us the kind of eternal happiness we're looking for. So if you're already middle class at Christmas, what you really can do if you're wanting to be happy rather than depressed at Christmas, be a gift giver. Don't think about yourself, think about others. Because what we know is that after about upper middle class, the people who give away their money in charity are actually more happy than everyone else.
Christmas, of course, as you know, is right around the corner. Everybody tends at this point to get caught up in consumerism, and that seems to be on the mindset. So then how do we sort of balance the healthy economy then and buying those gifts, like you said, giving to others, and at the same time sort of not giving into unbridled capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would say is enjoy all of these things. Enjoy the fact that Christianity has so impacted the culture in the West that even Christ's Mass is now a public and essentially a secular holiday. It's a federal holiday. Be glad for that. Be glad to participate in it, but be very careful about consumerism. If you're thinking about yourself and what you're going to get, you're more likely to be miserable rather than happy.
Such an important message and important to be focused on others. How important is that? Jay Richards, host of EWTN's Force for Good and professor at the Catholic University of America. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Finally tonight, a perfect mix of architecture and a sweet tooth just in time for Christmas. The Museum of Architecture in London has a new exhibit as part of its annual winter fundraising drive. Children can take part in a gingerbread decorating workshops after admiring the gingerbread city, complete with houses, bridges, and skyscrapers. The exhibit is open until Friday. And that's it for our show for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsbee. We thank you for watching. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.